Welcome today to today's Sparta season, edition. Today with Glen Rubsamen live from LA. Hi, Glen.
Hi.
Hi.
He's going to talk about his new painting series.
And afterwards there'll be a Q&A session, and as every week you'll find the link in the description below. So Glen, you can start if you want to.
Thank you. I'm not exactly in LA. I'm actually north of Los Angeles, about 150 miles on the reservation of the Santa Ynez Band of the Chumash Indians, and I can just see through the trees out the window here where they're building their new history museum, which is about half built, and there'll be a kind of historic recreation of a Chumash village. The whole area around here, from Santa Barbara, let's say north to Santa Maria, was sort of the homeland of the Chumash, and they let's say before the Spanish arrived, they had a thriving and very complex and interesting culture, which of course was unraveled and destroyed over the years. But I'll get into that later. I was born here in the US, but have spent the last part of my life sort of half in Europe and half in California, in Dusseldorf mainly, in Germany and in Los Angeles. And I'm a painter. I'm specifically interested in the landscape genre and let's say the depiction of, let's say, the world through landscape. And I started painting in 1990, so wow, almost 30 years ago now. And this is the sort of what I'd like to talk about today, is the latest series of paintings. I started painting them in May of 2020, so they are truly COVID artworks. They were painted in the, let's say, the atmosphere, the full, most, the strongest moment somehow in this first year of the COVID epidemic. As you might remember, Los Angeles had a particularly hard time in the, let's say, middle of last year. And then on May 25th of 2020, George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis. And this had a huge effect on somehow the already very difficult sort of psychological atmosphere in Los Angeles. And so these paintings really come from that time. And anyway, to give you a little background, I think, I guess in California, there was the lockdowns and the COVID pandemic environment was a little bit different than in other parts of the world. There, almost everything closed except fast food restaurants, supermarkets, of course, and the construction industry never stopped. So everybody was kind of hiding at home in their houses, except that the building was still going on in the city. Things were, let's say, new developments were still working at a incredible pace, and it was created this kind of very strange atmosphere. The highways were pretty much empty because people weren't going to work really, and there was a kind of atmosphere of extreme paranoia. No one really understood. Obviously, no one in the world understood what the virus, how the virus spreads, and so forth. But Los Angeles was and is the kind of home of, I think, mass car culture in the world. So somehow the automobile then became this kind of refuge for people. People could still get in their car and roll up the windows and drive around, and that was safe. So there was this kind of it sort of reinforced a kind of itinerant car culture that began in Los Angeles already in the 30s, and car sales went up. Everyone bought at least one more car so that they'd have an extra one, and the car service industry, the repair shops, tire stores, they were able to stay open during the pandemic. So it was a kind of odd, the society, let's say the government, so to speak, sort of supported this move towards complete car-centric consumerism. In fact, anything that you could do in your car was okay. And so this group of paintings kind of reflects this idea that sitting in the driver's seat of your car or in the passenger seat and looking out the window, you were safe and you were able to make decisions about the world based on the signage that you could see as you were driving down the street. You would spot a McDonald's or a Taco Bell, and you'd know that there was food. If you and you would spot a motel chain sign, a Holiday Inn or a Comfort Inn, and you'd know there was a place to stay. Or you would see, of course, gas stations stayed open because they had to fuel the car. So you would see a Chevron station or a Shell station, and you'd know that there was, fuel for your car. So these became this kind of menu that you had as you were driving around, and the signage, acted really like a menu. The bigger the sign, the more likely people were to stop, and so forth. But this, obviously, is historic already. But anyway, so I guess this very important moment on May 25th, when George Floyd was murdered, and let's say it became important for people to go out into the street and to protest, to say something, even in this scary environment of the pandemic. It was a kind of act of bravery, and this this became very difficult, in the sense that we didn't know whether it was our duty, really, as thinking people, to go out and to be seen, or whether we should continue to sort of, shelter in place in our homes and so forth. And anyway, so I started the first painting of the series, which is this painting, and what's the title of it? Let's see, I've forgotten. Where is it? Oh my God. It was called Seven. Yeah, that was the name of the painting. So it was a painting about these kind of fast, I guess, what are they called? Convenience stores, and they were allowed to stay open. And at the 7-Eleven, which was also obviously referred to the fact that it was open 7 days a week, 11 hours a day, you could buy just about anything to survive. And so it became a kind of image of sanctuary, in a way. And then behind it is this elaborate sort of net of telephone wires, cell phone wires, electrical cables, cellular connectors, and so forth. And then this became the kind of starting point for this series of pictures. And I think the most important, let's say, the hero of this painting are the telephone poles, and the hero, let's say the subject of the painting, so to speak. And I think the history of the telephone poles and telephone connections in the U.S. is a very dark one and a very difficult one. And at the time, I was reading this book called After the Apocalypse by Maureen F. McHugh, and it's a collection of short stories, let's say, about post-pandemic scenarios. So not only was I in a kind of paranoid, psychotic mood, but I was also reading, let's say, probably the greatest selection of short stories about a kind of pandemic mentality. I recommend them highly if you want to sort of indulge in a kind of near future science fiction. And the next painting, let's say, of this series had sort of a similar kind of combination of telephone poles and a dead palm tree, and then a street sign. But also, once again, the telephone pole was the kind of subject matter. In the late 19th century, Alexander Graham Bell built the first telephone poles in the U.S. Just to make, let's say, the first connections for this kind of burgeoning telephone industry. And shortly after, let's say the telephone poles started to be used as lynching poles for especially in the South, but in the North as well, to publicly hang Black men who were accused of a variety of crimes, usually trumped up. And in fact, photographs were even taken to sort of commemorate these lynchings. So from the very beginning, the telephone poles started to have this, let's say, connection with American racism, with this culture of lynching that was universal in the US. And thousands of Black men were lynched from telephone poles in the, shockingly to say, all the way up through the 50s. And so for some reason, for me, the telephone poles have this, they are symbols of, let's say, the sort of worst aspect of American culture at the time, this insipid racism that was found everywhere. And so for me, in these paintings, the telephone poles are a reminder of historical evil and brutality. They're not, for me, something pretty or something admirable. And as I said, the telephone poles themselves, of course, were not, at fault. That they just happened to be the perfect structure as a kind of quick gallows. They have also this. I mean, they resemble very much the crucifix, a crucifix too, which is just, I guess, sort of a kind of sad, let's say, design error by the telephone companies. They sort of, obviously, nobody was thinking in a historical way about the symbolism of this structure of how simple it would be to use in this kind of horrible environment of American racism. and these pictures that were on the television sets at the time of this this area of Minneapolis called the Powder Horn Park, where George Floyd was murdered, and how in every one of these pictures that were on the news, you would see the telephone poles in the background, but no one in let's say, people are so unaware visually of the landscape that that this becomes for me a kind of symbol, a kind of historical reminder of the history of racism in the US, and this kind of juxtaposition of American urbanism, like the Speedway gas station on the right, and the sort of car culture and racism, and this memorial to George Floyd. Of course, every picture once again had a telephone pole in it. But anyway, so this is where the telephone poles, this idea of the telephone poles, comes from in these paintings. This is a painting. Let me see. It's called Tobacco Road. It's I think I started it in middle June of 2020, and it's the name Tobacco Road is based on a novel of Erskine Caldwell, which is basically about this kind of migration of Black Americans north, because after the Civil War, there was obviously there was a shift from slavery to a kind of indentured servitude in a kind of sharecropper culture, and they didn't own the land, but they worked the land for a share of the crops, and this became more and more difficult. So there was a migration of Black Americans north into the industrial cities, let's say, to find work that was actually where you could actually make a living. And at the same time, the sort of let's say iconic cultural, let's say, gifts of Black culture to America, the cooking and the music and so forth, became, let's say, they were taken over by, let's say, white American corporatism. Colonel Sanders is the Colonel Sanders Fried Chicken, let's say, company is a great example. I mean, that fried chicken started, the whole culture of fried chicken started in the U.S. because chickens were the only. I'm sorry, this picture is a little bit small. Chickens were the only livestock that American slaves, Black slaves, were allowed to keep. They were the only creatures they were allowed to own, and so they became a very important kind of part of the, let's say, nutrition of, let's say, Black American slaves, but also they were a source of pride and a source of pleasure. But so out of this grew this culture of fried chicken, and Black Americans would started making fried chicken for their masters when they were slaves, and then later for for consumers. And this is really, I think, the beginning of takeout food culture in the U.S. Black women who were called, let's say, they had this title which was kind of known. They were called, let me see, waiter, waiter carriers, and they would go and they would sell fried chicken and coffee at the train stations to people, let's say, to white people who were traveling, and on the trains, and would stop in the train stations in the South, especially. This is a scene from Gordonsville, Virginia. Fried chicken and hot coffee, and this became a kind of cultural phenomena, which really was, somehow very much a part of the transportation culture at the time, because on the trains there wasn't any decent food, and so fried chicken became a kind of um, became a desirable commodity all over the country, and fried chicken stores started to appear. And there's another picture of the waiter carriers. So somehow the most famous fried chicken, let's say, restaurant in America, the sort of, let's say, spokesperson or cultural representative of this was a white man, kind of jolly white man with a what looked like the kind of outfit of a plantation owner. And so somehow this corporate identity of Kentucky Fried Chicken stole what was essentially, let's say, a cultural gift, a cultural innovation of the Black diaspora. And so in some ways, the painting, which this painting is about this contradiction. And go on again here. And this is another painting. Let's see what the title of this is. This one is called Circumstantial Evidence, which is a sort of, I guess, a legal term. And once again, it has these three elements that seem to be necessary for me to include in these paintings at the time. There was the telephone pole, which was once again a kind of symbol of this kind of connectivity of the present with all of these dark elements of the past, all of this these sort of black and terrible, let's say, precedents to our culture today. And then the tree, which was for me a kind of symbol of a kind of ancient nature of this of the earth, of the kind of almost like a kind of geological time. This is a painting of a California fan palm, Washingtonia robusta, which is actually a native palm tree to California. And now, of course, it's everywhere in the world because it was kind of distributed almost as a phenomena. It was the reason why it was given the name Washingtonia was because it was to commemorate, let's say, the first Washingtonia seeds were, I think, sold in London in the World's Fair in 1890. So they started to pop up, these trees, all over the world. And then, of course, the Taco Bell sign, which for me in California is a kind of terrible kind of symbol of kind of colonialism that spread in California already in the 16th century with the arrival of the Spanish. The Taco Bell symbol, this bell, is relates to the let's say the symbol of the California mission culture, which was let's say when the Spanish colonized California and sort of let's say built the first missions. Probably heard that he was just sainted. Junipero Serra, who was the kind of head of the whole mission system, they built these missions throughout California, and they let's say enslaved basically the local Indians, separating the men from the women, and then of course accidentally infecting them with European diseases, so their populations dwindled. So somehow this symbol of the bell, the California bell, is for me a symbol of a kind of I guess let's say one of the great kind of cultural crimes of the the past 400 years. The Taco Bell modeled its stores after the missions. The bell was also used as a way of marking the route by which the missionaries traveled through California, and still on the highways in the U.S. If it's, let's say this is Highway 1, you find this symbol of the of this bell. This is sort of, I guess, a terrible map, but it shows you all the missions. There were, more than 25 of them, and they were spaced pretty much a day's traveling apart, all the way up from, let's say, the border of Baja California, so San Diego, all the way up north of San Francisco. And they became also then a kind of method by which California, let's say, promoted itself as a tourist destination, but also as a, this idea of sort of creating a history out of nothing. And this also sort of, there was a huge fashion in Spanish, let's say, colonial architecture in California, and a kind of early postmodernism, if you will, where elements of Spanish architecture were incorporated with more modernist elements, and to create a kind of almost fake Spanish colonial style, but to remind people that of this history, which was glossed over because no one ever mentioned the fact. I mean, I didn't hear anything about it in school, that the local Indians, who were plentiful and flourishing, were basically decimated within a matter of 200 years. Yeah. So this route by which, that the missionaries, but they weren't just missionaries. The missionaries also had Spanish soldiers with them. The route that they took through California was called the El Camino Real, and these bells on the side of the road sort of commemorate that. And so the Taco Bell, let's say, fast food chain is one of these sort of moments where sort of capitalism uses an icon but does not realize how it's enforcing or reinforcing somehow a kind of dark history of let's say, cultural history. And but of course, with this is that I've noticed, painting the landscape in the last 30 years, is that everything that, the architecture, the trees, the sky, they all relate to let's say a kind of submerged history, which is usually very difficult and very sad. Anyway, there's one of the symbols, the early symbols of the Taco Bell chain was this kid, this kind of Mexican kid with a huge sombrero with tacos on it, and which was also a kind of racist. He was a sort of racist mascot of the Taco Bell chain. And the idea of the next thing I'd like to talk about is this idea of franchulates, which is a term I like very much, that was invented by Neil Stephenson, a science fiction writer, in his book called Snow Crash. And if you haven't read this book, I recommend it. I think it's the masterpiece of cyberpunk. It is so ahead of its time, and still today very fresh. There's a picture of Neil Stephenson, who's kind of one of my heroes, and he's still writing like crazy. I think he just came out with another book or two this year. And but anyway, the idea of franchulates, it's a combination of a franchise, which is basically most of these, let's say, the Taco Bell, the Exxon, the BP, they are owned by a person, but the owner pays the parent company a certain amount of money every month for the right to use the franchise, to use the logo, to get the special rates on food or gas or other things that belong to the chain. And as they, it's, you basically have to buy a franchise, and franchises have, I mean, they're literally volumes of corporate law about franchises and their taxation system, and it's probably the most important, let's say, economic structure in the U.S. right now. This franchising of, let's say, a certain kind of, I guess, the kind of global company. And so a franchise, according to Neil Stephenson, is a combination of a franchise and a consulate. So in this kind of future world where, let's say, government breaks down and there's a kind of, let's say, there is no more, that, let's say, the kind of law and order disappears, and there's a sort of, let's say, almost a kind of Wild West atmosphere, the franchises themselves start to act as little city nations. So, for example, if you were if you were a card-carrying member of the Taco Bell nation, you could go to the Taco Bell and you would receive sanctuary there. You know, like sort of like the Venezuelan consulate. You would be able to sleep there, wash there, eat there. And in this kind of balkanized world of Snow Crash, the if you didn't belong to a franchise, you were toast. You were probably dead within hours. And so you needed the protection of these multinational kind of mini governments. And so if you can imagine, for me, in sort of May, June of 2020, and driving around in my car in Los Angeles, and being kind of frightened of let's say, catching COVID by stepping out of the car. What became important to me was somehow finding a safe haven where you could sort of feel a little bit more protected. And somehow I started to prioritize kind of corporate culture over mom and pop culture. I would, if given a choice between a sort of small vegan restaurant run by smart, beautiful people, I would prefer to go to a Taco Bell, because I felt that somehow the corporate aspect of Taco Bell would protect me, that they had laws in place about sanitary procedures, that the food was prepared in such a way where no human hand touched it, and then it was delivered to you through a small window on the side of the restaurant into your car. So I started to sort of almost participate in this franchise culture. And once again, I'm sort of showing these pictures to sort of show how these logos started to become then almost a kind of menu of safe possibilities. And this world of signage, which was really a way of guiding people in their cars towards sanctuary. And this is, of course, but anyway, so I started to think about these logos, and I started to think about the sort of history of the way they developed. I mean, the sort of simplicity of them, but also the fact that they had to really be distinct from one another, so that nobody would mistake one for another. Here are, I guess, the major gas ones. I mean, they have incredible beauty to them, actually. If you look at the shell symbol obviously dates back to probably the Coquille Saint-Jacques, the shell carried by the pilgrims to Santiago de Compostela in the Middle Ages. It was a pilgrimage symbol, which is so perfect for itinerant car culture. But of course, nobody identifies the sort of ancient meaning of these symbols. The chevron, for example, is also a kind of ancient symbol. I think it was first developed in the Middle Ages. Obviously, the chevron car is an upside down chevron, but originally the chevron, let's say, was turned on the other side and represented, they say, the roofs of buildings that knights, let's say, conquered. So if you had a chevron or several chevrons in your coat of arms, it meant that you had conquered a city, or you had been on the Crusades and helped reconquer a Christian city from Islam. Or and then in the let's say in the military, the chevrons, let's say, turned upside down, became a symbol of good behavior. If you had two chevrons, that meant that you were really a good soldier. You didn't cause trouble. You were a good team player. You let's say followed the rules, so to speak. The 76 station logo, which I think is, of course, maybe the most beautiful of the car logos, is a direct reference to 1776, the let's say independence of the U.S. from Britain, and so forth and so forth. So on and on we go. And of course, the fast food logos, they are a world unto themselves. They have, we talked about Taco Bell a little bit, but obviously the other symbols are equally dense. And then, hotels, of course, which are a little less interesting, but somehow for me also equally rich. I think the Comfort Inn, for example, in the bottom left, which is my favorite, it's this sort of, in a strange way, a kind of symbol of my own ideas about landscape. This idea of a kind of fade of the sun on a blue background, and the idea of sunset, of course, being this moment of truth, and a moment where kind of the banal turns into the extraordinary, or some kind of transition takes place that is both beautiful and perhaps erotic, or perhaps other things. The Holiday Inn symbol I find very interesting, because for me it seems to represent in the H the telephone lines and the interconnectivity of these kind of let's say cables. And anyway, so basically looking at these symbols, this is a painting from, I think, also from June of 2020. What was the title of it? I just can't remember my own titles. Among the Living is the title. And I think for me, I wanted to depict let's say, the symbol of nature, the tree, as a kind of zombie, as a sort of robot nature. In this case, it's a cell phone tower disguised as a tree, and the sort of relationship it has in the perspective of the landscape. The Jack in the Box, of course, is a very strange logo unto itself, because it sort of refers to this little toy that was popular in the 19th century, where you wound a little, let's say, a little handle on the side of the toy, and then a puppet would pop out of the top and scare you. And the puppet was a kind of almost little kind of horror figure. So somehow Jack in the Box is this kind of reference to cinematic horror, like Stephen King or something like that. Here's a painting. Let's see, this, I call it onus probandi, which means basically it's a sort of Latin legal term that there's a thing called proof of doubt, that it's the onus is let's say the responsibility to prove the truth. And the symbol of it's actually a kind of historical symbol of mobile oil, because mobile oil now has much more simple logo. But in the 70s, still they had this symbol of Pegasus as the symbol of the of this oil company, which was, you know, this kind of beautiful symbol from Greek mythology, which you know, seemed to be you know, really kind of self-flattery on the part of the Mobil Oil Company, but once again very enigmatic. And then the Motel 6, which you know, for, you know, somehow for me very interesting about these hotel signs is that they usually have an additional bit of information on the sign that tells you something, let's say, more specific to your needs. Let's say if you're worried that you're not going to have Wi-Fi, then if the motel sign says Wi-Fi here, then you know, you are absolutely comforted by that fact, and you're more likely to sort of use their services. And so somehow the most important thing about this picture, even though it is such a melancholy image of a sort of tragic, almost you know, almost ancient now technology, is this is the Wi-Fi here part of the Motel 6 sign, which not only offers let's say a place to stay, but offers connectivity, but a different type of connectivity than the one that you're seeing in the painting, which is a kind of ancient one. You know, no one even uses landline telephones anymore. So you know, somehow the connections that are on these telephone poles are probably being used to carry you know, internet connection and not voice calls anymore. Super 8, another one of my favorite motel chains. And the Domino's pizza, which is sort of also for me one of these symbols that has all these references to gaming and to luck, I guess. A chevron painting. I'm forgetting to tell you the titles. Wait a second. This one is called Key Witness. I suppose for me the trees in this painting stand in or represent a kind of primordial nature, which I guess was the sort of what the makings of the fossil fuels that oil comes from. You know, the ancient bones of dinosaurs, which you know, become then crude oil, which then is extracted from the earth and purified, or let's say made into gasoline. Comfort in. This painting is called let me see, undertow, which is let's say the term for currents underneath the ocean waves that kind of pull you down. And you know, was this kind of, I think it was also a famous film noir movie in the 40s. Anyway, so obviously because of, as I said earlier, because of COVID, automobiles and sort of car culture became the official system of consuming, especially, I mean, in California, but probably everywhere in the world, in the sense that if you owned a car, you would feel safe in it. And somehow the drive-through culture in the US kind of blossomed. I mean, there were drive-up, let's say, marijuana dispensaries. There were, of course, drive-through Starbucks. There was, let's say, businesses that never had any kind of drive-up arrangements invented them. You know, you could call ahead and get your drugs delivered to your door at the pharmacy, or you could even go to, obviously, drive-in movies. which had pretty much died as a cultural activity in the US, but with the beginning of COVID, started to thrive again. And actually, we went to a couple of drive-ins, drive-in movie showings, and it was such a pleasure to be private in your car, but be social, because you knew that there were all these other cars around you, also with their windows closed, but somehow participating together in this movie, in this, entertainment culture or whatever. And somehow for me, the sort of iconic artwork of the 1960s about drive-through culture was Ed Ruscha's book, 26 Gasoline Stations. And it's very hard to find now, but I think there are let's say reprints of it. I think perhaps even at Koenig they have reprint, and it's really worth looking at. Basically, every page of the book depicted a gas station, or perhaps in this case, this is actually, I realize, from a different book called Vacant Lots. I'm sorry, this is the wrong picture, but another equally brilliant book of Ed Ruscha from the time about vacant lots. But anyway, this is an example of one of the double spread pages in Ed Ruscha's gasoline book. It was titled Union, Needles, California. So I think already Ed Ruscha was somehow incorporating these elements of the logo of the gas station, but also obviously, somehow making already the reference historically to what gasoline stations represent in the U.S. I mean, he's in one of his interviews, I think in the 60s, Ed Ruscha said that gasoline stations are the markers that let's say that the white man used to define the land that he stole from the Indians. And I think, this is I think, very profound thing to say in 1964. Another Knox Less, Oklahoma City. So these are, once again, another image from this book, which you can also look at it online. There's obviously the let's say the image of the gas station in painting has a great effect on me, and obviously this is once again a mobile gas station with a Pegasus symbol, and of course my mind, I cannot remember the name of the painter, but of course Hopper, Edward Hopper, right, from 1935. And then Ed Ruscha sort of translated these, let's say, I think from the book of the gas stations, he then made this painting that became so iconic called Standard. He made many versions of it, one of them where the gas station is in flames. But this, I think, was maybe the single most important painting for me as a young artist to sort of figure out what sort of what was interesting iconographically as a painter. And this is a painting from this series that I think I also painted in May of this year, which I suppose in a way kind of is my answer to Ed Ruscha. It's called Hit and Run, the painting. And it kind of describes this moment which happens every day in Los Angeles, especially on the in Santa Monica or on the Coast Highway, where there's this kind of moment of dread, of kind of deep existential fear that happens just at dusk. Where somehow all of the ghosts, all of the dead rise up and sort of join in the landscape. It's another painting from the same time. This company called Sinclair, which doesn't, I think, exist outside of the U.S., is probably the oldest, maybe the oldest gasoline company of all, and it's kind of interesting that it actually depicts the dinosaur on its logo, which is sort of a kind of truthfulness. I mean, that in the sense that it is actually saying, your product comes from the decayed bodies of creatures from the Jurassic period, and so there's a kind of honesty to this logo, in the sense that it sort of admits to the origins of the product, but also I think also has a kind of biblical connotation, in the sense that in Judeo-Christian culture, everything on this planet, everything in nature, everything on Earth was put there for the benefit of human beings. This is sort of what's basically, if you read between the lines of the Old Testament. So somehow this idea that God killed the dinosaurs so we could have gasoline today, kind of idea. Ironically, it's a kind of historic futurism. And Sinclair, the company, became, let's say, really famous for its World's Fair displays. And this is from 1964 World's Fair in New York City. It had a thing called Dino Land, where they built full-size replicas of, let's say, the most famous dinosaurs. And of course, all the school kids, if you were lucky, let's say the school would take you on a trip to the World's Fair, and they got free entrance, and so everyone was already, let's say, kids were already kind of brainwashed in a way between this relationship between, let's say, the history of the Earth, a kind of geological history, and let's say the logo of the company, this kind of logorific world where these companies then started to have more than just an economic, let's say, personality. They were more than that. They had almost a kind of national quality, like a franchulette. I would much prefer to belong to the Sinclair franchulette than the Chevron franchulette, because they have dinosaurs. And it's another term that I sort of fell in love with this year, which I guess was invented in Japan. And it's this idea of thinking locally and globally at the same time. So obviously in business, that means you are trying to almost mix up or kind of obscure the distinction between local and global. So that, and this of course is something that you see, around the world right now. And this is a Kentucky Fried Chicken outlet in Beijing. It still has the Colonel, but it also has all of these elements that are strictly Chinese. And somehow the two don't contradict each other. In this world of kind of global corporatism, everything is possible. And the Kentucky Fried Chicken in China has been obviously innovating. They've been innovating much more than the American, Kentucky Fried Chicken. On the left is actually a black bun surrounding a chicken patty with bacon on it, and then down the left they have a pink chicken sandwich. So if this is, I think, for me, a kind of perfect image of globalization, where you have intense creativity, but kind of in this kind of murky world where somehow the corporate identity of the product is international and local at the same time. This is a picture of the Burger King, I think, in what is this? Near the IKEA in the suburb of Düsseldorf. And what's that called? Rice holes? I don't know. Anyway, the Burger King Eingang. There's a painting I made of the Burger King let's say, logo in this kind of, I guess it's an atmosphere of kind of corporate agriculture, meaning sort of there's an area sort of south of or north of Santa Barbara, sort of near Oxnard, where there are these enormous fields that are mainly strawberries, where they grow strawberries. The AMPM, of course, which has become also global. It's a terrible picture. In the Philippines, the AMPM is known for its egg soufflés, which I guess, but of course in the US it's another convenience store. And once again, what I love about it is that it already suggests in its logo this transition from day to night, this moment of this kind of, I guess it's the right word for it. The Spanish use the word rocío, this kind of idea of the sunset, sunrise dilemma. So you're somehow the logo of the store already suggests this kind of 24-hour culture with these transitions from light to dark, and also this idea of a kind of colonization of the night in a way, that since humans are really not diurnal creatures. I mean, we can't see very well. Our night vision is terrible. Really, I think genetically we are meant to hide, in a cave at night, not be out, wandering around, going to the store. And of course, hotels. This is the Holiday Inn, I think, in Jeddah or Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. Another one in Saudi Arabia. Terrible pictures, sorry. And a painting I did at the same time, which I guess for me, sort of shows this relationship between the logo of the Holiday Inn and the way these telephone lines connect in the landscape. So the H of the Holiday Inn then becomes a kind of symbol for the telephone pole in a way. And I think Denny's, of course. This is Denny's in Kuwait, and somehow the Ramadan set menu at Denny's. Ramadan, of course, the time when you were only allowed to eat after dusk. And then this painting that I painted of the Denny's, which the Denny's doesn't really belong in a way to the drive-through culture, because it was one of the restaurants that had to close during the COVID crisis because it had no culture of drive-through. So in some ways, Denny's was a kind of tragic victim of the virus, of the epidemic, of the pandemic. And I think I'll leave it here. I think that's enough. Thank you for your generous attention.
Thank you very much for this great talk, and let's make a 10-minute break and see each other again at 2010, and I will send you the link. Perfect. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching,
Yeah,
and thank you for being
See
here.
you in the Q&A.
Oh yeah, see you at the Q&A.